The Hiramic legend. When Solomon, the beloved of God, builder of the everlasting house, and Grand Master of the Lodge of Jerusalem, ascended the throne of his father David, he consecrated his life to the erection of a temple to God and a palace for the kings of Israel. David's faithful friend, Hiram, king of Tyre, hearing that a son of David sat upon the throne of Israel, sent messages of congratulation and offers of assistance to the new ruler. In his History of the Jews, Josephus mentions that copies of the letters passing between the two kings were then to be seen both at Jerusalem and at Tyre. Despite Hiram's lack of appreciation for the 20 cities of Galilee, which Solomon presented to him upon the completion of the temple, the two monarchs remained the best of friends. Both were famous for their wit and wisdom, and when they exchanged letters, each devised puzzling questions to test the mental ingenuity of the other. Solomon made an agreement with Hiram of Tyre, promising vast amounts of barley, wheat, corn, wine, and oil as wages for the masons and carpenters from Tyre, who were to assist the Jews in the erection of the temple. Hiram also supplied cedars and other fine trees, which were made into rafts and floated down the sea to Joppa, whence they were taken inland by Solomon's workmen to the temple site. Because of his great love for Solomon, Hiram of Tyre sent also the Grand Master of the Dionysiac architects, Carim-Abif, a widow's son, who had no equal among the craftsmen of the earth. Carim is described as being a Tyrian by birch, but of Israelitish descent, and a second Bezaleel, honored by his king with the title of father. The Freemason's Pocket Companion, published in 1771, describes Carim as the most cunning, skillful, and curious workman that ever lived, whose abilities were not confined to building alone, but extended to all kinds of work, whether in gold, silver, brass, or iron, whether in linen, tapestry, or embroidery, whether considered as an architect, statuary, founder, or designer, separately or together, he equally excelled. From his designs, and under his direction, all the rich and splendid furniture of the temple and its several appendages were begun, carried on, and finished. Solomon appointed him, in his absence, to fill the chair as Deputy Grand Master, and in his presence, Senior Grand Warden, Master of Work, and General Overseer of all artists, as well those whom David had formerly procured from Tyre and Sidon, as those Hiram should now send. Modern Masonic writers differ as to the accuracy of the last sentence. Although an immense amount of labor was involved in its construction, Solomon's Temple, in the words of George Oliver, was only a small building and very inferior in point of size to some of our churches. The number of buildings contiguous to it and the vast treasure of gold and precious stones used in its construction concentrated a great amount of wealth within the temple area. In the midst of the temple stood the Holy of Holies, sometimes called the Oracle. It was an exact cube, each dimension being 20 cubits, and exemplified the influence of Egyptian symbolism. The buildings of the temple group were ornamented with 1,453 columns of Parian marble, magnificently sculptured, and 2,906 pilasters decorated with capitals. There was a broad porch facing the east, and the Sanctum Sanctorum was upon the west. According to tradition, the various buildings and courtyards could hold in all 300,000 persons. Both the sanctuary and the Holy of Holies were entirely lined with solid gold plates, encrusted with jewels. King Solomon began the building of the temple in the 4th year of his reign, on what would be, according to modern calculation, the 21st day of April, and finished it in the 11th year of his reign, on the 23rd day of October. The temple was begun in the 480th year after the children of Israel had passed the Red Sea. Part of the labor of construction included the building of an artificial foundation on the brow of Mount Moriah. The stones for the temple were hoisted from quarries directly beneath Mount Moriah and were trued before being brought to the surface. The brass and golden ornaments for the temple were cast in molds in the clay ground between Sukkoth and Zeradatha, and the wooden parts were all finished before they reached the temple site. The building was put together, consequently, without sound and without instruments, all its parts fitting exactly, without the hammer of contention, the axe of division, or any tool of mischief. Anderson's much-discussed Constitutions of the Freemasons, published in London in 1723, and reprinted by Benjamin Franklin in Philadelphia in 1734, thus describes the division of the laborers engaged in the building of the everlasting house. But Dagon's temple and the finest structures of Tyre and Sidon could not be compared with the eternal God's temple at Jerusalem. There were employed about it no less than 3,600 princes or master masons to conduct the work according to Solomon's directions, with 80,000 hewers of stone in the mountain, or fellow craftsmen, and 70,000 laborers, in all 153,600, besides the levy under Adoniram, to work in the mountains of Lebanon by turns with the Sidonians, viz., 30,000, being in all 183,600. Daniel Sickles gives 3,300 overseers instead of 3,600 and lists the three Grand Masters separately. The same author estimates the cost of the temple at nearly 4,000 millions of dollars. The Masonic legend of the building of Solomon's temple does not in every particular parallel the scriptural version, especially in those portions relating to Hiram-Abif. According to the biblical account, this master workman returned to his own country. In the Masonic allegory, he is foully murdered. On this point, A.E. Waite, in his new Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, makes the following explanatory comment. The legend of the master builder is the great allegory of Masonry. It happens that his figurative story is grounded on the fact of a personality mentioned in Holy Scripture, but this historical background is of the accidents and not the essence. The significance is in the allegory and not in any point of history which may lie behind it. Hiram, as master of the builders, divided his workmen into three groups, which were termed entered apprentices, fellow craftsmen, and master masons. To each division he gave certain passwords and signs by which their respective excellence could be quickly determined. While all were classified according to their merits, some were dissatisfied, for they desired a more exalted position than they were capable of filling. At last, three fellow craftsmen, more daring than their companions, determined to force Hiram to reveal to them the password of the master's degree. Knowing that Hiram always went into the unfinished sanctum sanctorum at high noon to pray, these ruffians, whose names were Jubela, Jubelo, and Jubilum, lay in wait for him, one at each of the main gates of the temple. Hiram, about to leave the temple by the south gate, was suddenly confronted by Jubela, armed with a 24-inch gauge. Upon Hiram's refusal to reveal the master's word, the ruffian struck him on the throat with the rule, and the wounded master then hastened to the west gate, where Jubelo, armed with a square, awaited him and made a similar demand. Again, Hiram was silent, and the second assassin struck him on the breast with the square. Hiram thereupon staggered to the east gate, only to be met there by Jubilum, armed with a maul. When Hiram refused him the master's word, Jubilum struck the master between the eyes with the mallet, and Hiram fell dead. The body of Hiram was buried by the murderers over the brow of Mount Moriah, and a sprig of acacia placed upon the grave. The murderers then sought to escape punishment for their crime by embarking for Ethiopia, but the port was closed. All three were finally captured, and after admitting their guilt, were duly executed. Parties of three were then sent out by King Solomon, and one of these groups discovered the newly made grave marked by the evergreen sprig. After the entered apprentices and the fellow craftsmen had failed to resurrect their master from the dead, he was finally raised by the master mason with the strong grip of a lion's paw. To the initiated builder, the name Hiram-Abif signifies "my father, the universal spirit, one in essence, three in aspect." Thus, the murdered master is a type of the cosmic martyr, the crucified spirit of good, the dying God, whose mystery is celebrated throughout the world. Among the manuscripts of Dr. Sigismund Bastrom, the initiated Rosicrucian, appears the following extract from von Welling concerning the true philosophic nature of the Masonic Chiram. The original word Mariach, Chiram, is a radical word consisting of three consonants ha and mi, e, cheth, resh, and mem. 1. Cheth signifies chama, the sun's light, i.e. the universal, invisible, cold fire of nature attracted by the sun, manifested into light and sent down to us and to every planetary body belonging to the solar system. 2. Resh signifies Hia-Ruach, i.e. spirit, air, wind, as being the vehicle which conveys and collects the light into numberless foci, wherein the solar rays of light are agitated by a circular motion and manifested in heat and burning fire. 3, or mem, signifies magim, water humidity, but rather the mother of water, i.e., radical humidity or a particular kind of condensed air. These 3 constitute the universal agent or fire of nature in one word, emriach, kiram, not hiram. Albert Pike mentions several forms of the name Chiram, Kirm, Kerm, and Kur-Om, the latter ending in the sacred Hindu monosyllable Om, which may also be extracted from the names of the 3 murderers. Pike further relates the 3 ruffians to a triad of stars in the constellation of Libra, and also calls attention to the fact that the Chaldean god Baal, metamorphosed into a demon by the Jews, appears in the name of each of the murderers, Jubala, Jubilo, and Jubilum. To interpret the Hiramic legend requires familiarity with both the Pythagorean and Kabbalistic systems of numbers and letters, and also the philosophic and astronomic cycles of the Egyptians, Chaldeans, and Brahmins. For example, consider the number 33. The first Temple of Solomon stood for 33 years in its pristine splendor. At the end of that time, it was pillaged by the Egyptian king Shishak, and finally, 588 BC, it was completely destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, and the people of Jerusalem were led into captivity to Babylon. See General History of Freemasonry by Robert McCoy. Also, King David ruled for 33 years in Jerusalem. The Masonic order is divided into 33 symbolic degrees. There are 33 segments in the human spinal column, and Jesus was crucified in the 33rd year of his life. The efforts made to discover the origin of the Hiramic legend show that, while the legend in its present form is comparatively modern, its underlying principles run back to remotest antiquity. It is generally admitted by modern Masonic scholars that the story of the martyred Chiram is based upon the Egyptian rites of Osiris, whose death and resurrection figuratively portrayed the spiritual death of man and his regeneration through initiation into the mysteries. Chiram is also identified with Hermes through the inscription on the Emerald Table. From these associations, it is evident that Chiram is to be considered as a prototype of humanity. In fact, he is Plato's idea, archetype, of man. As Adam, after the fall, symbolizes the idea of human degeneration, so Chiram, through his resurrection, symbolizes the idea of human regeneration. On the 19th day of March, 1314, Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templars, was burned on a pyre erected upon that point of the islet of the Seine, at Paris, where afterwards was erected the statue of King Henry IV. See The Indian Religions by Hargrave Jennings. It is mentioned as a tradition in some of the accounts of the burning, writes Jennings, that Molay, ere he expired, summoned Clement, the Pope who had pronounced the bull of abolition against the order and had condemned the Grand Master to the flames, to appear within 40 days before the Supreme Eternal Judge, and Philip the King to the same awful tribunal within the space of a year. Both predictions were fulfilled. The close relationship between Freemasonry and the original Knights Templars has caused the story of Chiram to be linked with the martyrdom of Jacques de Molay. According to this interpretation, the 3 ruffians who cruelly slew their master at the gates of the temple because he refused to reveal the secrets of his order represent the Pope, the King, and the executioners. De Molay died maintaining his innocence and refusing to disclose the philosophical and magical arcana of the Templars. Those who have sought to identify Chiram with the murdered King Charles I conceive the Hiramic legend to have been invented for that purpose by Elias Ashmole, a mystical philosopher, who was probably a member of the Rosicrucian fraternity. Charles was dethroned in 1647 and died on the block in 1649, leaving the Royalist party leaderless. An attempt has been made to relate the term, the Sons of the Widow, an appellation frequently applied to members of the Masonic order, to this incident in English history, for by the murder of her king, England became a widow, and all Englishmen widows' sons. To the mystic Christian Mason, Chiram represents the Christ who in 3 degrees, raised the temple of his body from its earthly sepulchre. His 3 murderers were Caesar's agent, the state, the Sanhedrin, the church, and the incited populace, the mob. Thus considered, Chiram becomes the higher nature of man, and the murderers are ignorance, superstition, and fear. The indwelling Christ can give expression to himself in this world only through man's thoughts, feelings, and actions. Right thinking, right feeling, and right action. These are three gates through which the Christ power passes into the material world, there to labor in the erection of the temple of universal brotherhood. Ignorance, superstition, and fear are three ruffians through whose agencies the spirit of good is murdered, and a false kingdom, controlled by wrong thinking, wrong feeling, and wrong action, established in its stead. In the material universe, evil appears ever victorious. In this sense, writes Daniel Sickles, the myth of the Tyrian is perpetually repeated in the history of human affairs. Orpheus was murdered and his body thrown into the Hebrus. Socrates was made to drink the hemlock. And, in all ages, we have seen evil temporarily triumphant and virtue and truth calumniated, persecuted, crucified, and slain. But eternal justice marches surely and swiftly through the world. The Typhons, the children of darkness, the plotters of crime, all the infinitely varied forms of evil are swept into oblivion, and truth and virtue, for a time laid low, come forth, clothed with diviner majesty and crowned with everlasting glory. See General Ahimon Rezan. If, as there is ample reason to suspect, the modern Freemasonic order was profoundly influenced by, if it is not an actual outgrowth of, Francis Bacon's secret society, its symbolism is undoubtedly permeated with Bacon's two great ideals, universal education and universal democracy. The deadly enemies of universal education are ignorance, superstition, and fear, by which the human soul is held in bondage to the lowest part of its own constitution. The errant enemies of universal democracy have ever been the crown, the tiara, and the torch. Thus, Hiram symbolizes that ideal state of spiritual, intellectual, and physical emancipation which has ever been sacrificed upon the altar of human selfishness. Hiram is the beautifier of the eternal house. Modern utilitarianism, however, sacrifices the beautiful for the practical, in the same breath declaring the obvious lie that selfishness, hatred, and discord are practical. Dr. Orville Ward Owen found a considerable part of the first 32 degrees of Freemasonic ritualism hidden in the text of the first Shakespeare folio. Masonic emblems are to be observed also upon the title pages of nearly every book published by Bacon. Sir Francis Bacon considered himself as a living sacrifice upon the altar of human need. He was obviously cut down in the midst of his labors, and no student of his New Atlantis can fail to recognize the Masonic symbolism contained therein. According to the observations of Joseph Fort Newton, the Temple of Solomon, described by Bacon in that utopian romance, was not a house at all, but the name of an ideal state. Is it not true that the Temple of Freemasonry is also emblematic of a condition of society? While, as before stated, the principles of the Hiramic legend are of the greatest antiquity, it is not impossible that its present form may be based upon incidents in the life of Lord Bacon, who passed through the philosophic death and was raised in Germany. In an old manuscript appears the statement that the Freemasonic order was formed by alchemists and Hermetic philosophers who had banded themselves together to protect their secrets against the infamous methods used by avaricious persons to wring from them the secret of gold-making. The fact that the Hiramic legend contains an alchemical formula gives credence to this story. Thus, the building of Solomon's temple represents the consummation of the magnum opus, which cannot be realized without the assistance of Hiram, the universal agent. The Masonic mysteries teach the initiate how to prepare within his own soul a miraculous powder of projection by which it is possible for him to transmute the base lump of human ignorance, perversion, and discord into an ingot of spiritual and philosophic gold. Sufficient similarity exists between the Masonic Chiram and the Kundalini of Hindu mysticism to warrant the assumption that Chiram may be considered a symbol also of the spirit fire moving through the sixth ventricle of the spinal column. The exact science of human regeneration is the lost key of Masonry, for when the spirit fire is lifted up through the 33 degrees, or segments of the spinal column, and enters into the domed chamber of the human skull, it finally passes into the pituitary body, Isis, where it invokes Ra, the pineal gland, and demands the sacred name. Operative Masonry, in the fullest meaning of that term, signifies the process by which the Eye of Horus is opened. E.A. Wallace Budge has noted that in some of the papyri illustrating the entrance of the souls of the dead into the judgment hall of Osiris. The deceased person has a pine cone attached to the crown of his head. The Greek mystics also carried a symbolic staff, the upper end being in the form of a pine cone, which was called the thyrsus of Bacchus. In the human brain, there is a tiny gland called the pineal body, which is the sacred eye of the ancients, and corresponds to the third eye of the Cyclops. Little is known concerning the function of the pineal body, which Descartes suggested, more wisely than he knew, might be the abode of the spirit of man. As its name signifies, the pineal gland is the sacred pine cone in man. The eye single, which cannot be opened until Chiram, the spirit fire, is raised through the sacred seals, which are called the seven churches in Asia. There is an Oriental painting which shows 3 sunbursts. One sunburst covers the head, in the midst of which sits Brahma with 4 heads, his body a mysterious dark color. The second sunburst, which covers the heart, solar plexus, and upper abdominal region, shows Vishnu sitting in the blossom of the lotus on a couch formed of the coils of the serpent of cosmic motion, its 7-hooded head forming a canopy over the god. The third sunburst is over the generative system, in the midst of which sits Shiva, his body a grayish-white, and the Ganges River flowing out of the crown of his head. This painting was the work of a Hindu mystic who spent many years subtly concealing great philosophical principles within these figures. The Christian legends could be related also to the human body by the same method as the Oriental, for the arcane meanings hidden in the teachings of both schools are identical. As applied to Masonry, the 3 sunbursts represent the gates of the temple at which Chiram was struck, there being no gate in the north because the sun never shines from the northern angle of the heavens. The north is the symbol of the physical because of its relation to ice, crystallized water, and to the body, crystallized spirit. In man, the light shines toward the north but never from it, because the body has no light of its own, but shines with the reflected glory of the divine life particles concealed within physical substance. For this reason, the moon is accepted as the symbol of man's physical nature. Chiram is the mysterious, fiery, airy water, which must be raised through the 3 grand centers, symbolized by the ladder with 3 rungs and the sunburst flowers mentioned in the description of the Hindu painting. It must also pass upward by means of the ladder of 7 rungs, the 7 plexuses proximate to the spine. The 9 segments of the sacrum and coccyx are pierced by 10 foramina, through which pass the roots of the tree of life. 9 is the sacred number of man, and in the symbolism of the sacrum and coccyx, a great mystery is concealed. That part of the body from the kidneys downward was termed by the early Kabbalists the land of Egypt, into which the children of Israel were taken during the captivity. Out of Egypt, Moses, the illuminated mind, as his name implies, led the tribes of Israel, the 12 faculties, by raising the brazen serpent in the wilderness upon the symbol of the Tau cross. Not only Chiram, but the god-men of nearly every pagan mystery ritual are personifications of the spirit fire in the human spinal cord. The astronomical aspect of the Hiramic legend must not be overlooked. The tragedy of Chiram is enacted annually by the sun during its passage through the signs of the zodiac. From the journey of the sun through the 12 signs, writes Albert Pike, come the legend of the 12 labors of Hercules and the incarnations of Vishnu and Buddha. Hence came the legend of the murder of Kurum, representative of the sun, by the 3 fellow crafts, symbols of the winter signs, Capricornus, Aquarius, and Pisces, who assailed him at the 3 gates of heaven and slew him at the winter solstice. Hence the search for him by the 9 fellow crafts, the other 9 signs, his finding, burial, and resurrection. See Morals and Dogma. Other authors consider Libra, Scorpio, and Sagittarius as the 3 murderers of the sun, inasmuch as Osiris was murdered by Typhon, to whom were assigned the 30 degrees of the constellation of Scorpio. In the Christian mysteries, also Judas signifies the scorpion, and the 30 pieces of silver for which he betrayed his Lord represent the number of degrees in that sign. Having been struck by Libra, the state, Scorpio, the church, and Sagittarius, the mob, the sun, Chiram, is secretly home through the darkness by the signs of Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces, and buried over the brow of a hill, the vernal equinox. Capricorn has for its symbol an old man with a scythe in his hand. This is Father Time, a wayfarer, who is symbolized in Masonry as straightening out the ringlets of a young girl's hair. If the Weeping Virgin be considered a symbol of Virgo, and Father Time with his scythe a symbol of Capricorn, then the interval of 90 degrees between these two signs will be found to correspond to that occupied by the three murderers. Esoterically, the urn containing the ashes of Hiram represents the human heart. Saturn, the old man who lives at the North Pole, and brings with him to the children of men a sprig of evergreen, the Christmas tree, is familiar to the little folks under the name of Santa Claus, for he brings each winter the gift of a new year. The martyred sun is discovered by Ares, a fellow craftsman, and at the vernal equinox the process of raising him begins. This is finally accomplished by the Lion of Judah, who in ancient times occupied the position of the keystone of the royal arch of heaven. The precession of the equinoxes causes various signs to play the role of the murderers of the sun during the different ages of the world, but the principle involved remains unchanged. Such is the cosmic story of Hiram, the universal benefactor, the fiery architect of the divine house, who carries with him to the grave that lost word which, when spoken, raises all life to power and glory. According to Christian mysticism, when the lost word is found, it is discovered in a stable, surrounded by beasts and marked by a star. After the sun leaves Leo, writes Robert Hewitt Brown, the days begin to grow unequivocally shorter as the sun declines toward the autumnal equinox, to be again slain by the 3 autumnal months, lie dead through the 3 winter ones, and be raised again by the 3 vernal ones. Each year, the great tragedy is repeated, and the glorious resurrection takes place. See Stellar Theology and Masonic Astronomy. Hiram is termed dead because in the average individual, the cosmic creative forces are limited in their manifestation to purely physical and correspondingly materialistic expression. Obsessed by his belief in the reality and permanence of physical existence, man does not correlate the material universe with the blank north wall of the temple. As the solar light symbolically is said to die as it approaches the winter solstice, so the physical world may be termed the winter solstice of the spirit. Reaching the winter solstice, the sun apparently stands still for 3 days, and then, rolling away the stone of winter, begins its triumphal march north towards the summer solstice. The condition of ignorance may be likened to the winter solstice of philosophy, spiritual understanding to the summer solstice. From this point of view, initiation into the mysteries becomes the vernal equinox of the spirit, at which time the Hiram in man crosses from the realm of mortality into that of eternal life. The autumnal equinox is analogous to the mythological fall of man, at which time the human spirit descended into the realms of Hades by being immersed in the illusion of terrestrial existence. In an essay on the beautiful, Plotinus describes the refining effect of beauty upon the unfolding consciousness of man. Commissioned to decorate the everlasting house, Hiram Abiff is the embodiment of the beautifying principle. Beauty is essential to the natural unfoldment of the human soul. The mysteries held that man, in part at least, was the product of his environment. Therefore, they considered it imperative that every person be surrounded by objects which would evoke the highest and noblest sentiments. They proved that it was possible to produce beauty in life by surrounding life with beauty. They discovered that symmetrical bodies were built by souls continuously in the presence of symmetrical bodies, that noble thoughts were produced by minds surrounded by examples of mental nobility. Conversely, if a man were forced to look upon an ignoble or asymmetrical structure, it would arouse within him a sense of ignobility, which would provoke him to commit ignoble deeds. If an ill-proportioned building were erected in the midst of a city, there would be ill-proportioned children born in that community, and men and women, gazing upon the asymmetrical structure, would live inharmonious lives. Thoughtful men of antiquity realized that their great philosophers were the natural products of the aesthetic ideals of architecture, music, and art, established as the standards of the cultural systems of the time. The substitution of the discord of the fantastic for the harmony of the beautiful constitutes one of the great tragedies of every civilization. Not only were the savior gods of the ancient world beautiful, but each performed a ministry of beauty, seeking to effect man's regeneration by arousing within him the love of the beautiful. A renaissance of the golden age of fable can be made possible only by the elevation of beauty to its rightful dignity as the all-pervading, idealizing quality in the religious, ethical, sociological, scientific, and political departments of life. The Dionysiac architects were consecrated to the raising of their master spirit, cosmic beauty, from the sepulchre of material ignorance and selfishness, by erecting buildings which were such perfect exemplars of symmetry and majesty that they were actually magical formulae by which was evoked the spirit of the martyred beautifier, entombed within a materialistic world. In the Masonic mysteries, the triune spirit of man, the light delta, is symbolized by the three grand masters of the Lodge of Jerusalem. As God is the pervading principle of three worlds, in each of which he manifests as an active principle, so the spirit of man, partaking of the nature of divinity, dwells upon three planes of being: the supreme, the superior, and the inferior spheres of the Pythagoreans. At the gate of the inferior sphere, the underworld, or dwelling place of mortal creatures, stands the guardian of Hades, the three-headed dog Cerberus, who is analogous to the three murderers of the Hiramic legend. According to this symbolic interpretation of the triune spirit, Hiram is the third, or incarnating, part, the master builder, who through all ages erects living temples of flesh and blood as shrines of the Most High. Hiram comes forth as a flower and is cut down. He dies at the gates of matter. He is buried in the elements of creation, but, like Thor, he swings his mighty hammer in the fields of space, sets the primordial atoms in motion, and establishes order out of chaos. As the potentiality of cosmic power within each human soul, Hiram lies waiting for man, by the elaborate ritualism of life, to transmute potentiality into divine potency. As the sense perceptions of the individual increase, however, man gains ever greater control over his various parts, and the spirit of life within gradually attains freedom. The three murderers represent the laws of the inferior world: birth, growth, and decay, which ever frustrate the plan of the builder. To the average individual, physical birth actually signifies the death of Hiram, and physical death the resurrection of Hiram. To the initiate, however, the resurrection of the spiritual nature is accomplished without the intervention of physical death. The curious symbols found in the base of Cleopatra's Needle, now standing in Central Park, New York, were interpreted as being of first Masonic significance by S.A. Zola, 33 degrees past Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Egypt. Masons' marks and symbols are to be found on the stones of numerous public buildings, not only in England and on the continent, but also in Asia. In his Indian Masons' marks of the Mughal dynasty, A. Gorham describes scores of markings appearing on the walls of buildings such as the Taj Mahal, the Jama Masjid, and that famous Masonic structure, the Qutb Minar. According to those who regard Masonry as an outgrowth of the secret society of architects and builders, which for thousands of years formed a caste of master craftsmen, Hiram Abiff was the Tyrian Grand Master of a worldwide organization of artisans, with headquarters in Tyre. Their philosophy consisted of incorporating into the measurements and ornamentation of temples, palaces, mausoleums, fortresses, and other public buildings their knowledge of the laws controlling the universe. Every initiated workman was given a hieroglyphic with which he marked the stones he trewed to show to all posterity that he thus dedicated to the supreme architect of the universe each perfected product of his labor. Concerning Mason's marks, Robert Freak Gould writes, "It is very remarkable that these marks are to be found in all countries, in the chambers of the Great Pyramid at Giza, on the underground walls of Jerusalem, in Herculaneum and Pompeii, on Roman walls and Grecian temples, in Hindustan, Mexico, Peru, Asia Minor, as well as on the great ruins of England, France, Germany, Scotland, Italy, Portugal, and Spain." See a concise history of Freemasonry. From this viewpoint, the story of Hiram may well represent the incorporation of the divine secrets of architecture into the actual parts and dimensions of earthly buildings. The 3 degrees of the craft bury the Grand Master, the Great Arcanum, in the actual structure they erect, after first having killed him with the builder's tools, by reducing the dimensionless spirit of cosmic beauty to the limitations of concrete form. These abstract ideals of architecture can be resurrected, however, by the master mason who, by meditating upon the structure, releases therefrom the divine principles of architectonic philosophy incorporated or buried within it. Thus, the physical building is actually the tomb or embodiment of the creative ideal, of which its material dimensions are but the shadow. Moreover, the Hiramic legend may be considered to embody the vicissitudes of philosophy itself. As institutions for the dissemination of ethical culture, the pagan mysteries were the architects of civilization. Their power and dignity were personified in Kairama Biff, the master builder, but they eventually fell a victim to the onslaughts of that recurrent trio of state, church, and mob. They were desecrated by the state, jealous of their wealth and power, by the early church, fearful of their wisdom, and by the rabble or soldiery incited by both state and church. As Karam, when raised from his grave, whispers the master mason's word, which was lost through his untimely death, so according to the tenets of philosophy, the re-establishment or resurrection of the ancient mysteries will result in the rediscovery of that secret teaching without which civilization must continue in a state of spiritual confusion and uncertainty. When the mob governs, man is ruled by ignorance. When the church governs, he is ruled by superstition. And when the state governs, he is ruled by fear. Before men can live together in harmony and understanding, ignorance must be transmuted into wisdom, superstition into an illumined faith, and fear into love. Despite statements to the contrary, Masonry is a religion seeking to unite God and man by elevating its initiates to that level of consciousness whereon they can behold with clarified vision the workings of the great architect of the universe. From age to age, the vision of a perfect civilization is preserved as the ideal for mankind. In the midst of that civilization shall stand a mighty university, wherein both the sacred and secular sciences concerning the mysteries of life will be freely taught to all who will assume the philosophic life. Here creed and dogma will have no place. The superficial will be removed, and only the essential be preserved. The world will be ruled by its most illumined minds, and each will occupy the position for which he is most admirably fitted. The great university will be divided into grades, admission to which will be through preliminary tests or initiations. Here mankind will be instructed in the most sacred, the most secret, and the most enduring of all mysteries, symbolism. Here the initiate will be taught that every visible object, every abstract thought, every emotional reaction is but the symbol of an eternal principle. Here mankind will learn that Kiram truth lies buried in every atom of cosmos, that every form is a symbol, and every symbol the tomb of an eternal verity. Through education, spiritual, mental, moral, and physical, man will learn to release living truths from their lifeless coverings. The perfect government of the earth must be patterned eventually after that divine government by which the universe is ordered. In that day when perfect order is reestablished, with peace universal and good triumphant, men will no longer seek for happiness, for they shall find it welling up within themselves. Dead hopes, dead aspirations, dead virtues shall rise from their graves, and the spirit of beauty and goodness, repeatedly slain by ignorant men, shall again be the master of work. Then shall sages sit upon the seats of the mighty, and the gods walk with men. The Pythagorean theory of music and color. Harmony is a state recognized by great philosophers as the immediate prerequisite of beauty. A compound is termed beautiful only when its parts are in harmonious combination. The world is called beautiful, and its creator is designated the good because good perforce must act in conformity with its own nature, and good acting according to its own nature is harmony, because the good which it accomplishes is harmonious with the good which it is. Beauty, therefore, is harmony manifesting its own intrinsic nature in the world of form. The universe is made up of successive gradations of good, these gradations ascending from matter, which is the least degree of good, to spirit, which is the greatest degree of good. In man, his superior nature is the summum bonum. It therefore follows that his highest nature most readily cognizes good because the good external to him in the world is in harmonic ratio with the good present in his soul. What man terms evil is therefore, in common with matter, merely the least degree of its own opposite. The least degree of good presupposes likewise the least degree of harmony and beauty. Thus, deformity, evil, is really the least harmonious combination of elements, naturally harmonic as individual units. Deformity is unnatural, for, the sum of all things being the good, it is natural that all things should partake of the good and be arranged in combinations that are harmonious. Harmony is the manifesting expression of the will of the eternal good. The philosophy of music. It is highly probable that the Greek initiates gained their knowledge of the philosophic and therapeutic aspects of music from the Egyptians, who in turn considered Hermes the founder of the art. According to one legend, this god constructed the first lyre by stretching strings across the concavity of a turtle shell. Both Isis and Osiris were patrons of music and poetry. Plato, in describing the antiquity of these arts among the Egyptians, declared that songs and poetry had existed in Egypt for at least 10,000 years, and that these were of such an exalted and inspiring nature that only gods or godlike men could have composed them. In the mysteries, the lyre was regarded as the secret symbol of the human constitution, the body of the instrument representing the physical form, the strings the nerves, and the musician the spirit. Playing upon the nerves, the spirit thus. One day, while meditating upon the problem of harmony, Pythagoras chanced to pass a brazier's shop where workmen were pounding out a piece of metal upon an anvil. By noting the variances in pitch between the sounds made by large hammers and those made by smaller implements, and carefully estimating the harmonies and discords resulting from combinations of these sounds, he gained his first clue to the musical intervals of the diatonic scale. He entered the shop, and after carefully examining the tools and making mental note of their weights, returned to his own house and constructed an arm of wood so that it extended out from the wall of his room. At regular intervals along this arm, he attached 4 chords, all of like composition, size, and weight. To the first of these, he attached a 12-pound weight, to the second, a 9-pound weight, to the third, an 8-pound weight, and to the fourth, a 6-pound weight. These different weights corresponded to the sizes of the brazier's hammers. Pythagoras thereupon discovered that the first and fourth strings, when sounded together, produced the harmonic interval of the octave, for doubling the weight had the same effect as halving the string. The tension of the first string being twice that of the fourth string, their ratio was said to be 2:1, or duple. By similar experimentation, he ascertained that the first and third string produced the harmony of the diapente, or the interval of the fifth. The tension of the first string being half again as much as that of the third string, their ratio was said to be 3:2, or sesquialter. Likewise, the second and fourth strings, having the same ratio as the first and third strings, yielded a diapenta harmony. Continuing his investigation, Pythagoras discovered that the first and second strings produced the harmony of the diatessaron, or the interval of the third, and the tension of the first string being a third greater than that of the second string, their ratio was said to be 4:3, or sesquitercian. The third and fourth strings, having the same ratio as the first and second strings, produced another harmony of the diatessaron. According to Iamblichus, the second and third strings had the ratio of 8:9, or epogdoan. The key to harmonic ratios is hidden in the famous Pythagorean tetractys, or pyramid of dots. The tetractys is made up of the first 4 numbers, 1, 2, 3, and 4, which in their proportions reveal the intervals of the octave, the diapente, and the diatessaron. While the law of harmonic intervals as set forth above is true, it has been subsequently proved that hammers striking metal in the manner described will not produce the various tones ascribed to them. In all probability, therefore, Pythagoras actually worked out his theory of harmony from the monochord, a contrivance consisting of a single string stretched between 2 pegs and supplied with movable frets. To Pythagoras, music was one of the dependencies of the divine science of mathematics, and its harmonies were inflexibly controlled by mathematical proportions. The Pythagoreans averred that mathematics demonstrated the exact method by which the good established and maintained its universe. Number therefore preceded harmony, since it was the immutable law that governs all harmonic proportions. After discovering these harmonic ratios, Pythagoras gradually initiated his disciples into this, the supreme arcanum of his mysteries. He divided the multitudinous parts of creation into a vast number of planes or spheres, to each of which he assigned a tone, a harmonic interval, a number, a name, a color, and a form. He then proceeded to prove the accuracy of his deductions by demonstrating them upon the different planes of intelligence and substance, ranging from the most abstract logical premise to the most concrete geometrical solid. From the common agreement of these diversified methods of proof, he established the indisputable existence of certain natural laws. Having once established music as an exact science, Pythagoras applied his newly found law of harmonic intervals to all the phenomena of nature, even going so far as to demonstrate the harmonic relationship of the planets, constellations, and elements to each other. A notable example of modern corroboration of ancient philosophical reaching is that of the progression of the elements according to harmonic ratios. While making a list of the elements in the ascending order of their atomic weights, John A. Newlands discovered at every eighth element a distinct repetition of properties. This discovery is known as the law of octaves in modern chemistry. Since they held that harmony must be determined not by the sense perceptions, but by reason and mathematics, the Pythagoreans called themselves canonics, as distinguished from musicians of the harmonic school, who asserted taste and instinct to be the true normative principles of harmony. Recognizing, however, the profound effect of music upon the senses and emotions, Pythagoras did not hesitate to influence the mind and body with what he termed musical medicine. Pythagoras evinced such a marked preference for stringed instruments that he even went so far as to warn his disciples against allowing their ears to be defiled by the sounds of flutes or cymbals. He further declared that the soul could be purified from its irrational influences by solemn songs sung to the accompaniment of the lyre. In his investigation of the therapeutic value of harmonics, Pythagoras discovered that the 7 modes, or keys, of the Greek system of music had the power to incite or allay the various emotions. It is related that while observing the stars one night, he encountered a young man befuddled with strong drink and mad with jealousy, who was piling faggots about his mistress's door with the intention of burning the house. The frenzy of the youth was accentuated by a flutist a short distance away who was playing a tune in the stirring Phrygian mode. Pythagoras induced the musician to change his air to the slow and rhythmic spondaic mode, whereupon the intoxicated youth immediately became composed and, gathering up his bundles of wood, returned quietly to his own home. There is also an account of how Empedocles, a disciple of Pythagoras, by quickly changing the mode of a musical composition he was playing, saved the life of his host, Anchitas, when the latter was threatened with death by the sword of one whose father he had condemned to public execution. It is also known that Aesculapius, the Greek physician, cured sciatica and other diseases of the nerves by blowing a loud trumpet in the presence of the patient. Pythagoras cured many ailments of the spirit, soul, and body by having certain specially prepared musical compositions played in the presence of the sufferer, or by personally reciting short selections from such early poets as Hesiod and Homer. In his university at Crotona, it was customary for the Pythagoreans to open and to close each day with songs, those in the morning calculated to clear the mind from sleep and inspire it to the activities of the coming day, those in the evening of a mode soothing, relaxing, and conducive to rest. At the vernal equinox, Pythagoras caused his disciples to gather in a circle around one of their number, who led them in song and played their accompaniment upon a lyre. The therapeutic music of Pythagoras is described by Iamblichus thus: "And there are certain melodies devised as remedies against the passions of the soul, and also against despondency and lamentation, which Pythagoras invented as things that afford the greatest assistance in these maladies. And again, he employed other melodies against rage and anger, and against every aberration of the soul. There is also another kind of modulation invented as a remedy against desires. See the life of Pythagoras." It is probable that the Pythagoreans recognized a connection between the 7 Greek modes and the planets. As an example, Pliny declares that Saturn moves in the Dorian mode and Jupiter in the Phrygian mode. It is also apparent that the temperaments are keyed to the various modes, and the passions likewise. Thus, anger, which is a fiery passion, may be accentuated by a fiery mode or its power neutralized by a watery mode. The far-reaching effect exercised by music upon the culture of the Greeks is thus summed up by Emil Naumann. Plato depreciated the notion that music was intended solely to create cheerful and agreeable emotions, maintaining rather that it should inculcate a love of all that is noble and hatred of all that is mean, and that nothing could more strongly influence man's innermost feelings than melody and rhythm. Firmly convinced of this, he agreed with Damon of Athens, the musical instructor of Socrates, that the introduction of a new and presumably enervating scale would endanger the future of a whole nation, and that it was not possible to alter a key without shaking the very foundations of the state. Plato affirmed that music which ennobled the mind was of a far higher kind than that which merely appealed to the senses, and he strongly insisted that it was the paramount duty of the legislature to suppress all music of an effeminate and lascivious character, and to encourage only that which was pure and dignified, that bold and stirring melodies were for men, gentle and soothing ones for women. From this, it is evident that music played a considerable part in the education of the Greek youth. The greatest care was also to be taken in the selection of instrumental music, because the absence of words rendered its signification doubtful, and it was difficult to foresee whether it would exercise upon the people a benign or baneful influence. Popular taste, being always tickled by sensuous and meretricious effects, was to be treated with deserved contempt. See the history of music. Even today, martial music is used with telling effect in times of war, and religious music, while no longer developed in accordance with the ancient theory, still profoundly influences the emotions of the laity. The music of the spheres. The most sublime but least known of all the Pythagorean speculations was that of sidereal harmonics. It was said that of all men, only Pythagoras heard the music of the spheres. Apparently, the Chaldeans were the first people to conceive of the heavenly bodies joining in a cosmic chant as they moved in stately manner across the sky. Job describes a time when the stars of the morning sang together, and in The Merchant of Venice, the author of the Shakespearean plays writes, "There's not the smallest orb which thou beholdst, but in his motion like an angel sings." So little remains, however, of the Pythagorean system of celestial music that it is only possible to approximate his actual theory. Pythagoras conceived the universe to be an immense monochord, with its single string connected at its upper end to absolute spirit and at its lower end to absolute matter. In other words, a cord stretched between heaven and earth. Counting inward from the circumference of the heavens, Pythagoras, according to some authorities, divided the universe into 9 parts, according to others into 12 parts. The 12-fold system was as follows. The first division was called the Empyrean, or the sphere of the fixed stars, and was the dwelling place of the immortals. The second to 12th divisions were, in order, the spheres of Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, and the Moon, and fire, air, water, and earth. This arrangement of the 7 planets, the Sun and Moon being regarded as planets in the old astronomy, is identical with the candlestick symbolism of the Jews, the sun in the center as the main stem with 3 planets on either side of it. The names given by the Pythagoreans to the various notes of the diatonic scale were, according to Macrobius, derived from an estimation of the velocity and magnitude of the planetary bodies. Each of these gigantic spheres, as it rushed endlessly through space, was believed to sound a certain tone, caused by its continuous displacement of the ethereal diffusion. As these tones were a manifestation of divine order and motion, it must necessarily follow that they partook of the harmony of their own source. The assertion that the planets in their revolutions round the earth uttered certain sounds, differing according to their respective magnitude, celerity, and local distance, was commonly made by the Greeks. Thus Saturn, the farthest planet, was said to give the gravest note, while the Moon, which is the nearest, gave the sharpest. These sounds of the 7 planets and the sphere of the fixed stars, together with that above us, Antichthon, are the 9 muses, and their joint symphony is called mnemosyne. See the canon. This quotation contains an obscure reference to the 9-fold division of the universe previously mentioned. The Greek initiates also recognized a fundamental relationship between the individual heavens or spheres of the seven planets and the seven sacred vowels. The first heaven uttered the sound of the sacred vowel alpha, the second heaven the sacred vowel epsilon, the third eta, the fourth iota, the fifth omicron, the sixth upsilon, and the seventh heaven the sacred vowel omega. When these seven heavens sing together, they produce a perfect harmony which ascends as an everlasting praise to the throne of the Creator. See Irenaeus against heresies. Although not so stated, it is probable that the planetary heavens are to be considered as ascending in the Pythagorean order, beginning with the sphere of the moon, which would be the first heaven. Many early instruments had 7 strings, and it is generally conceded that Pythagoras was the one who added the 8th string to the lyre of Terpander. The 7 strings were always related both to their correspondences in the human body and to the planets. The names of God were also conceived to be formed from combinations of the 7 planetary harmonies. The Egyptians confined their sacred songs to the 7 primary sounds, forbidding any others to be uttered in their temples. One of their hymns contained the following invocation: "The 7 sounding tones praise thee, the great God, the ceaseless working Father of the whole universe." In another, the deity describes himself thus: "I am the great indestructible lyre of the whole world, attuning the songs of the heavens." See Naumann's History of Music. The Pythagoreans believed that everything which existed had a voice, and that all creatures were eternally singing the praise of the Creator. Man fails to hear these divine melodies because his soul is enmeshed in the illusion of material existence. When he liberates himself from the bondage of the lower world with its sense limitations, the music of the spheres will again be audible as it was in the Golden Age. Harmony recognizes harmony, and when the human soul regains its true estate, it will not only hear the celestial choir, but also join with it in an everlasting anthem of praise to that eternal good controlling the infinite number of parts and conditions of being. The Greek mysteries included in their doctrines a magnificent concept of the relationship existing between music and form. The elements of architecture, for example, were considered as comparable to musical modes and notes, or as having a musical counterpart. Consequently, when a building was erected in which a number of these elements were combined, the structure was then likened to a musical chord, which was harmonic only when it fully satisfied the mathematical requirements of harmonic intervals. The realization of this analogy between sound and form led Goethe to declare that architecture is crystallized music. In constructing their temples of initiation, the early priests frequently demonstrated their superior knowledge of the principles underlying the phenomena known as vibration. A considerable part of the mystery rituals consisted of invocations and intonements, for which purpose special sound chambers were constructed. A word whispered in one of these apartments was so intensified that the reverberations made the entire building sway and be filled with a deafening roar. The very wood and stone used in the erection of these sacred buildings eventually became so thoroughly permeated with the sound vibrations of the religious ceremonies that when struck, they would reproduce the same tones, thus repeatedly impressed into their substances by the rituals. Every element in nature has its individual keynote. If these elements are combined in a composite structure, the result is a chord that, if sounded, will disintegrate the compound into its integral parts. Likewise, each individual has a keynote that, if sounded, will destroy him. The allegory of the walls of Jericho falling when the trumpets of Israel were sounded is undoubtedly intended to set forth the arcane significance of individual keynote or vibration. The philosophy of color. Light, writes Edwin D. Babbitt, reveals the glories of the external world and yet is the most glorious of them all. It gives beauty, reveals beauty, and is itself most beautiful. It is the analyzer, the truth-teller, and the exposer of shams, for it shows things as they are. Its infinite streams measure off the universe and flow into our telescopes from stars which are quintillions of miles distant. On the other hand, it descends to objects inconceivably small and reveals through the microscope objects 50 millions of times less than can be seen by the naked eye. Like all other fine forces, its movement is wonderfully soft, yet penetrating and powerful. Without its vivifying influence, vegetable, animal, and human life must immediately perish from the earth, and general ruin take place. We shall do well, then, to consider this potential and beautiful principle of light and its component colors, for the more deeply we penetrate into its inner laws, the more will it present itself as a marvelous storehouse of power to vitalize, heal, refine, and delight mankind. See the principles of light and color. Since light is the basic physical manifestation of life, bathing all creation in its radiance, it is highly important to realize, in part at least, the subtle nature of this divine substance. That which is called light is actually a rate of vibration causing certain reactions upon the optic nerve. Few realize how they are walled in by the limitations of the sense perceptions. Not only is there a great deal more to light than anyone has ever seen, but there are also unknown forms of light which no optical equipment will ever register. There are unnumbered colors which cannot be seen, as well as sounds which cannot be heard, odors which cannot be smelt, flavors which cannot be tasted, and substances which cannot be felt. Man is thus surrounded by a supersensible universe of which he knows nothing because the centers of sense perception within himself have not been developed sufficiently to respond to the subtler rates of vibration of which that universe is composed. Among both civilized and savage peoples, color has been accepted as a natural language in which to couch their religious and philosophical doctrines. The ancient city of Ecbatana, as described by Herodotus, its 7 walls, colored according to the 7 planets, revealed the knowledge of this subject possessed by the Persian Magi. The famous zikkurat, or astronomical tower of the god Nebo at Borsippa, ascended in 7 great steps or stages, each step being painted in the key color of one of the planetary bodies. See Lenormand's Chaldean magic. It is thus evident that the Babylonians were familiar with the concept of the spectrum in its relation to the 7 creative gods or powers. In India, one of the Mughal emperors caused a fountain to be made with 7 levels. The water pouring down the sides through specially arranged channels changed color as it descended, passing sequentially through all shades of the spectrum. In Tibet, color is employed by the native artists to express various moods. L. Austin Waddell, writing of northern Buddhist art, notes that in Tibetan mythology, white and yellow complexions usually typify mild moods, while the red, blue, and black belong to fierce forms, though sometimes light blue, as indicating the sky, means merely celestial. Generally, the gods are pictured white, goblins red, and devils black, like their European relative. See the Buddhism of Tibet. In Meno, Plato, speaking through Socrates, describes color as an effluence of form, commensurate with sight, and sensible. In Theaetetus, he discourses more at length on the subject thus: let us carry out the principle which has just been affirmed, that nothing is self-existent, and then we shall see that every color, white, black, and every other color, arises out of the eye meeting the appropriate motion, and that what we term the substance of each color is neither the active nor the passive element, but something which passes between them, and is peculiar to each percipient. Are you certain that the several colors appear to every animal, say a dog, as they appear to you? In the Pythagorean tetractys, the supreme symbol of universal forces and processes, are set forth the theories of the Greeks concerning color and music. The first 3 dots represent the threefold white light, which is the Godhead containing potentially all sound and color. The remaining 7 dots are the colors of the spectrum and the notes of the musical scale. The colors and tones are the active creative powers which, emanating from the first cause, establish the universe. The 7 are divided into 2 groups, one containing 3 powers and the other 4, a relationship also shown in the tetractys. The higher group, that of 3, becomes the spiritual nature of the created universe. The lower group, that of 4, manifests as the irrational sphere or inferior world. In the mysteries, the 7 logi, or creative lords, are shown as streams of force issuing from the mouth of the Eternal One. This signifies the spectrum being extracted from the white light of the supreme deity. The 7 creators, or fabricators, of the inferior spheres were called by the Jews the Elohim. By the Egyptians, they were referred to as the builders, sometimes as the governors, and are depicted with great knives in their hands, with which they carved the universe from its primordial substance. Worship of the planets is based upon their acceptation as the cosmic embodiments of the 7 creative attributes of God. The lords of the planets were described as dwelling within the body of the sun, for the true nature of the sun, being analogous to the white light, contains the seeds of all the tone and color potencies which it manifests. There are numerous arbitrary arrangements setting forth the mutual relationships of the planets, the colors, and the musical notes. The most satisfactory system is that based upon the law of the octave. The sense of hearing has a much wider scope than that of sight, for whereas the ear can register from 9 to 11 octaves of sound, the eye is restricted to the cognition of but 7 fundamental color tones, or 1 tone short of the octave. Red, when posited as the lowest color tone in the scale of chromatics, thus corresponds to do, the first note of the musical scale. Continuing the analogy, orange corresponds to re, yellow to mi, green to fa, blue to sol, indigo to la, and violet to si. The 8th color tone necessary to complete the scale should be the higher octave of red, the first color tone. The accuracy of the above arrangement is attested by 2 striking facts. 1. The 3 fundamental notes of the musical scale, the first, the third, and the 5th, correspond with the 3 primary colors, red, yellow, and blue. 2. The 7th and least perfect note of the musical scale corresponds with purple, the least perfect tone of the color scale. In the Principles of Light and Color, Edwin D. Babbitt confirms the correspondence of the color and musical scales. As C is at the bottom of the musical scale and made with the coarsest waves of air, so is red at the bottom of the chromatic scale and made with the coarsest waves of luminous ether. As the musical note B, the 7th note of the scale, requires 45 vibrations of air every time the note C at the lower end of the scale requires 24, or but little over half as many, so does extreme violet require about 300 trillions of vibrations of ether in a second, while extreme red requires only about 450 trillions, which also are but little more than half as many. When one musical octave is finished, another one commences and progresses with just twice as many vibrations as were used in the first octave, and so the same notes are repeated on a finer scale. In the same way, when the scale of colors visible to the ordinary eye is completed in the violet, another octave of finer invisible colors, with just twice as many vibrations, will commence and progress on precisely the same law. When the colors are related to the 12 signs of the zodiac, they are arranged as the spokes of a wheel. To Aries is assigned pure red, to Taurus red-orange, to Gemini pure orange, to Cancer orange-yellow, to Leo pure yellow, to Virgo yellow-green, to Libra pure green, to Scorpio green-blue, to Sagittarius pure blue, to Capricorn blue-violet, to Aquarius pure violet, and to Pisces violet-red. In expounding the Eastern system of esoteric philosophy, H.P. Blavatsky relates the colors to the septenary constitution of man and the 7 states of matter as follows. Color principles of man. States of matter. Violet chaya, or etheric double ether. Indigo higher manas, or spiritual intelligence. Critical state, called air blue, auric envelope steam, or vapor green lower manas, or animal soul critical state yellow buddhi, or spiritual soul water orange prana, or life principle critical state red kama rupa, or seed of animal life ice. This arrangement of the colors of the spectrum and the musical notes of the octave necessitates a different grouping of the planets in order to preserve their proper tone and color analogies. Thus dew becomes Mars, Re the Sun, Me Mercury, Fa Saturn, Sol Jupiter, Psi the Moon. Fishes, insects, animals, reptiles, and birds. Part 1. The creatures inhabiting the water, air, and earth were held in veneration by all races of antiquity. Realizing that visible bodies are only symbols of invisible forces, the ancients worshipped the divine power through the lower kingdoms of nature, because those less evolved and more simply constituted creatures responded most readily to the creative impulses of the gods. The sages of old studied living things to a point of realization that God is most perfectly understood through a knowledge of his supreme handiwork, animate and inanimate nature. Every existing creature manifests some aspect of the intelligence or power of the Eternal One, who can never be known save through a study and appreciation of his numbered but inconceivable parts. When a creature is chosen, therefore, to symbolize to the concrete human mind some concealed abstract principle, it is because its characteristics demonstrate this invisible principle in visible action. Fishes, insects, animals, reptiles, and birds appear in the religious symbolism of nearly all nations, because the forms and habits of these creatures and the media in which they exist closely relate them to the various generative and germinative powers of nature, which were considered as prima facie evidence of divine omnipresence. The early philosophers and scientists, realizing that all life has its origin in water, chose the fish as the symbol of the life germ. The fact that fishes are most prolific makes the simile still more apt. While the early priests may not have possessed the instruments necessary to analyze the spermatozoon, they concluded by deduction that it resembled a fish. Fishes were sacred to the Greeks and Romans, being connected with the worship of Aphrodite, Venus. An interesting survival of pagan ritualism is found in the custom of eating fish on Friday. Freya, in whose honor the day was named, was the Scandinavian Venus, and this day was sacred among many nations to the goddess of beauty and fecundity. This analogy further links the fish with the procreative mystery. Friday is also sacred to the followers of the prophet Mohammed. The word nun means both fish and growth, and as Inman says, the Jews were led to victory by the son of the fish, whose other names were Joshua and Jesus, the Savior. Nun is still the name of a female devotee of the Christian faith. Among early Christians, 3 fishes were used to symbolize the Trinity, and the fish is also one of the 8 sacred symbols of the great Buddha. It is also significant that the dolphin should be sacred to both Apollo, the solar savior, and Neptune. It was believed that this fish carried shipwrecked sailors to heaven on its back. The dolphin was accepted by the early Christians as an emblem of Christ because the pagans had viewed this beautiful creature as a friend and benefactor of man. The heir to the throne of France, the Dauphin, may have secured his title from this ancient pagan symbol of the divine preservative power. The first advocates of Christianity likened converts to fishes, who at the time of baptism returned again into the sea of Christ. Primitive peoples believed the sea and land were inhabited by strange creatures, and early books on zoology contain curious illustrations of composite beasts, reptiles, and fishes, which did not exist at the time the medieval authors compiled these voluminous books. In the ancient initiatory rituals of the Persian, Greek, and Egyptian mysteries, the priests disguised themselves as composite creatures, thereby symbolizing different aspects of human consciousness. They used birds and reptiles as emblems of their various deities, often creating forms of grotesque appearance and assigning to them imaginary traits, habits, and places of domicile, all of which were symbolic of certain spiritual and transcendental truths, thus concealed from the profane. The phoenix made its nest of incense and flames. The unicorn had the body of a horse, the feet of an elephant, and the tail of a wild boar. The upper half of the centaur's body was human, and the lower half equine. The pelican of the Hermetists fed its young from its own breast, and to this bird were assigned other mysterious attributes which could have been true only allegorically. Though regarded by many writers of the Middle Ages as actual living creatures, none of these, the pelican excepted, ever existed outside the symbolism of the mysteries. Possibly they originated in rumors of animals then little known. In the temple, however, they became a reality, for there they signified the manifold characteristics of man's nature. The mantichora had certain points in common with the hyena. The unicorn may have been the single-horned rhinoceros. To the student of the secret wisdom, these composite animals and birds simply represent various forces working in the invisible worlds. This is a point which nearly all writers on the subject of medieval monsters seem to have overlooked. See Vlissus Aldrovandis' Monstrorum Historia, 1642, and Physica Curiosa by P. Gaspare Scotto, 1697. There are also legends to the effect that long before the appearance of human beings, there existed a race or species of composite creatures which was destroyed by the gods. The temples of antiquity preserved their own historical records and possessed information concerning the prehistoric world that has never been revealed to the uninitiated. According to these records, the human race evolved from a species of creature that partook somewhat of the nature of an amphibian, for at that time primitive man had the gills of a fish and was partly covered with scales. To a limited degree, the human embryo demonstrates the possibility of such a condition. As a result of the theory of man's origin in water, the fish was looked upon as the progenitor of the human family. This gave rise to the ichthyology of the Chaldeans, Phoenicians, and Brahmins. The American Indians believe that the waters of lakes, rivers, and oceans are inhabited by a mysterious people, the Water Indians. The fish has been used as an emblem of damnation, but among the Chinese it typified contentment and good fortune, and fishes appear on many of their coins. When Typhon, or Set, the Egyptian evil genius, had divided the body of the god Osiris into 14 parts, he cast one part into the river Nile, where, according to Plutarch, it was devoured by 3 fishes, the Lepidotus, probably the Lepidosiren, the Phagris, and the Oxyrhynchus, a form of pike. For this reason, the Egyptians would not eat the flesh of these fishes, believing that to do so would be to devour the body of their god. When used as a symbol of evil, the fish represented the earth, man's lower nature, and the tomb, the sepulchre of the mysteries. Thus was Jonah 3 days in the belly of the great fish, as Christ was 3 days in the tomb. Several early church fathers believed that the whale, which swallowed Jonah, was the symbol of God the Father, who, when the hapless prophet was thrown overboard, accepted Jonah into his own nature until a place of safety was reached. The story of Jonah is really a legend of initiation into the mysteries, and the great fish represents the darkness of ignorance which engulfs man when he is thrown over the side of the ship, is born into the sea life. The custom of building ships in the form of fishes or birds, common in ancient times, could give rise to the story, and mayhap Jonah was merely picked up by another vessel and carried into port, the pattern of the ship causing it to be called a great fish. Veritatis simplex oratio est. More probably, the whale of Jonah is based upon the pagan mythological creature, Hippocampus, part horse and part dolphin, for the early Christian statues and carvings show the composite creature and not a true whale. It is reasonable to suppose that the mysterious sea serpents, which, according to the Mayan and Toltec legends, brought the gods to Mexico, were Viking or Chaldean ships built a ship of composite sea monsters or dragons. H.P. Blavatsky advances the theory that the word Cetus, the great whale, is derived from Keto, a name for the fish god Dagon, and that Jonah was actually confined in a cell hollowed out in the body of a gigantic statue of Dagon after he had been captured by Phoenician sailors and carried to one of their cities. There is no doubt a great mystery in the gigantic form of Cetus, which is still preserved as a constellation. According to many scattered fragments extant, man's lower nature was symbolized by a tremendous, awkward creature resembling a great sea serpent or dragon called Leviathan. All symbols having serpentine form or motion signify the solar energy in one of its many forms. This great creature of the sea therefore represents the solar life force imprisoned in water and also the divine energy coursing through the body of man, where, until transmuted, it manifests itself as a writhing, twisting monster, man's greeds, passions, and lusts. Among the symbols of Christ as the Savior of men are a number relating to the mystery of his divine nature concealed within the personality of the lowly Jesus. The Gnostics divided the nature of the Christian Redeemer into 2 parts, the one Jesus, a mortal man, the other Christos, a personification of Nous, the principle of cosmic mind. Nu, the greater, was for the period of 3 years, from baptism to crucifixion, using the fleshly garment of the mortal man, Jesus. In order to illustrate this point and still conceal it from the ignorant, many strange and often repulsive creatures were used whose rough exteriors concealed magnificent organisms. Keneally, in his notes on the Book of Enoch, observes, "Why the caterpillar was a symbol of the Messiah is evident, because, under a lowly, creeping, and wholly terrestrial aspect, he conceals the beautiful butterfly form, with its radiant wings, emulating in its varied colors the rainbow, the serpent, the salmon, the scarab, the peacock, and the dying dolphin." Insects. In 1609, Henry Kunrath's Amphitheatrum Sapientia Aeterna was published. Eliphas Levi declared that within its pages are concealed all the great secrets of magical philosophy. A remarkable plate in this work shows the Hermetic sciences being attacked by the bigoted and ignorant pedagogues of the 17th century. In order to express his complete contempt for his slanderers, Hunrath made out of each a composite beast, adding donkey ears to one and a false tail to another. He reserved the upper part of the picture for certain petty backbiters whom he gave appropriate forms. The air was filled with strange creatures, great dragonflies, winged frogs, birds with human heads, and other weird forms which defy description, heaping venom, gossip, spite, slander, and other forms of persecution upon the secret arcanum of the wise. The drawing indicated that their attacks were ineffectual. Poisonous insects were often used to symbolize the deadly power of the human tongue. Insects of all kinds were also considered emblematic of the nature spirits and daemons, for both were believed to inhabit the atmosphere. Medieval drawings showing magicians in the act of invoking spirits often portray the mysterious powers of the other world, which the conjurer has exorcised, as appearing to him in composite part-insect forms. The early philosophers apparently held the opinion that the disease which swept through communities in the form of plagues were actually living creatures, but instead of considering a number of tiny germs, they viewed the entire plague as one individuality and gave it a hideous shape to symbolize its destructiveness. The fact that plagues came in the air caused an insect or a bird to be used as their symbol. Beautiful symmetrical forms were assigned to all natural benevolent conditions or powers, but to unnatural or malevolent powers were assigned contorted and abnormal figures. The evil one was either hideously deformed or else of the nature of certain despised animals. A popular superstition during the Middle Ages held that the devil had the feet of a rooster, while the Egyptians assigned to Typhon, devil, the body of a hog. The habits of the insects were carefully studied. Therefore, the ant was looked upon as emblematic of industry and foresight, as it stored up supplies for the winter and also had strength to move objects many times its own weight. The locusts, which swept down in clouds and in some parts of Africa and Asia obscured the sun and destroyed every green thing, were considered fit emblems of passion, disease, hate, and strife. For these emotions destroy all that is good in the soul of man and leave a barren desert behind them. In the folklore of various nations, certain insects are given special significance, but the ones which have received worldwide veneration and consideration ate the scarab, the king of the insect kingdom, the scorpion, the great betrayer, the butterfly, the emblem of metamorphosis, and the bee, the symbol of industry. The Egyptian scarab is one of the most remarkable symbolic figures ever conceived by the mind of man. It was evolved by the erudition of the priestcraft from a simple insect, which, because of its peculiar habits and appearance, properly symbolized the strength of the body, the resurrection of the soul, and the eternal and incomprehensible Creator in his aspect as Lord of the Sun. E. A. Wallace Budge says, in effect, of the worship of the scarab by the Egyptians. Yet another view, held in primitive times, was that the sky was a vast meadow over which a huge beetle crawled, pushing the disk of the sun before him. This beetle was the sky god, and arguing from the example of the beetle, Scarabaeus sacer, which was observed to roll along with its hind legs a ball that was believed to contain its eggs, the early Egyptians thought that the ball of the sky god contained his egg and that the sun was his offspring. Thanks, however, to the investigations of the eminent entomologist, Monsieur J. H. Faber, we now know that the ball which the Scarabaeus sacer rolls along contains not its eggs, but dung that is to serve as food for its egg, which it lays in a carefully prepared place. Initiates of the Egyptian mysteries were sometimes called scarabs, again, lions and panthers. The scarab was the emissary of the sun, symbolizing light, truth, and regeneration. Stone scarabs, called heart scarabs, about 3 inches long, were placed in the heart cavity of the dead when that organ was removed to be embalmed separately as part of the process of mummifying. Some maintain that the stone beetles were merely wrapped in the winding cloths at the time of preparing the body for eternal preservation. The following passage concerning this appears in the great Egyptian book of initiation, the Book of the Dead. And behold, thou shalt make a scarab of green stone, which shall be placed in the breast of a man, and it shall perform for him the opening of the mouth. The funeral rites of many nations bear a striking resemblance to the initiatory ceremonies of their mysteries. Ra, the god of the sun, had three important aspects. As the creator of the universe, he was symbolized by the head of a scarab and was called Khepera, which signified the resurrection of the soul and a new life at the end of the mortal span. The mummy cases of the Egyptian dead were nearly always ornamented with scarabs. Usually one of these beetles, with outspread wings, was painted on the mummy case directly over the breast of the dead. The finding of such great numbers of small stone scarabs indicates that they were a favorite article of adornment among the Egyptians. Because of its relationship to the sun, the scarab symbolized the divine part of man's nature. The fact that its beautiful wings were concealed under its glossy shell typified the winged soul of man hidden within its earthly sheath. The Egyptian soldiers were given the scarab as their special symbol because the ancients believed that these creatures were all of the male sex and consequently appropriate emblems of virility, strength, and courage. Plutarch noted the fact that the scarab rolled its peculiar ball of dung backwards while the insect itself faced the opposite direction. This made it an especially fitting symbol for the sun, because this orb, according to Egyptian astronomy, was rolling from west to east, although apparently moving in the opposite direction. An Egyptian allegory states that the sunrise is caused by the scarab unfolding its wings, which stretch out as glorious colors on each side of its body, the solar globe, and that when it folds its wings under its dark shell at sunset, night follows. Khepera, the scarab-headed aspect of Ra, is often symbolized riding through the sea of the sky in a wonderful ship called the Boat of the Sun. The scorpion is the symbol of both wisdom and self-destruction. It was called by the Egyptians the creature accursed. The time of year when the sun entered the sign of Scorpio marked the beginning of the rulership of Typhon. When the 12 signs of the zodiac were used to represent the 12 apostles, although the reverse is true, the scorpion was assigned to Judas Iscariot, the betrayer. The scorpion stings with its tail, and for this reason it has been called a backbiter, a false and deceitful thing. Calmet, in his Dictionary of the Bible, declares the scorpion to be a fit emblem of the wicked and the symbol of persecution. The dry winds of Egypt are said to be produced by Typhon, who imparts to the sand the blistering heat of the infernal world and the sting of the scorpion. This insect was also the symbol of the spinal fire which, according to the Egyptian mysteries, destroyed man when it was permitted to gather at the base of his spine, the tail of the scorpion. The red star Antares in the back of the celestial scorpion was considered the worst light in the heavens. Kalb al-Akrab, or the heart of the scorpion, was called by the ancients the lieutenant or deputy of Mars. See footnote to Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos. Antares was believed to impair the eyesight, often causing blindness if it rose over the horizon when a child was born. This may refer again to the sandstorm, which was capable of blinding unwary travelers. The scorpion was also the symbol of wisdom, for the fire which it controlled was capable of illuminating as well as consuming. Initiation into the greater mysteries among the pagans was said to take place only in the sign of the scorpion. In the Papyrus of Ani, the Book of the Dead, the deceased likens his soul to a scorpion, saying, "I am a swallow, I am that scorpion, the daughter of Ra." Elizabeth Goldsmith, in her treatise on sex symbolism, states that the scorpions were a symbol of Selk, the Egyptian goddess of writing, and also were revered by the Babylonians and Assyrians as guardians of the gateway of the sun. 7 scorpions were said to have accompanied Isis when she searched for the remains of Osiris scattered by Set, Typhon. In his Chaldean account of the Genesis, George Smith, copying from the cuneiform cylinders, in describing the wanderings of the hero Izdubar, Nimrod, throws some light on the scorpion god who guards the sun. The tablet which he translated is not perfect, but the meaning is fairly clear. Who each day guard the rising sun. Their crown was at the lattice of heaven. Under hell their feet were placed, the spinal column. The scorpion man guarded the gate, burning with terribleness. Their appearance was like death. The might of his fear shook the forest. At the rising of the sun and the setting of the sun, they guarded the sun. Izdubar saw them, and fear and terror came into his face. Among the early Latins, there was a machine of war called the scorpion. It was used for firing arrows and probably obtained its name from a long beam, resembling a scorpion's tail, which flew up to hurl the arrows. The missiles discharged by this machine were also called scorpions. The butterfly, under the name of Psyche, a beautiful maiden with wings of opalescent light, symbolizes the human soul because of the stages it passes through in order to unfold its power of flight. The three divisions through which the butterfly passes in its unfoldment resemble closely the 3 degrees of the mystery school, which degrees are regarded as consummating the unfoldment of man by giving him emblematic wings by which he may soar to the skies. Unregenerate man, ignorant and helpless, is symbolized by the stage between ovum and larva, the disciple, seeking truth and dwelling in medication, by the second stage, from larva to pupa, at which time the insect enters its chrysalis, the tomb of the mysteries. The third stage, from pupa to imago, wherein the perfect butterfly comes forth, typifies the unfolded enlightened soul of the initiate rising from the tomb of his baser nature. Night moths typify the secret wisdom because they are hard to discover and are concealed by the darkness, ignorance. Some are emblems of death, as Acherontia atropos, the death's head moth, which has a marking on its body somewhat like a human skull. The death watch beetle, which was believed to give warning of approaching death by a peculiar ticking sound, is another instance of insects involved in human affairs. Opinions differ concerning the spider. Its shape makes it an appropriate emblem of the nerve plexus and ganglia of the human body. Some Europeans consider it extremely bad luck to kill a spider, possibly because it is looked upon as an emissary of the evil one, whom no person desires to offend. There is a mystery concerning all poisonous creatures, especially insects. Paracelsus taught that the spider was the medium for a powerful but evil force which the black magicians used in their nefarious undertakings. Certain plants, minerals, and animals have been sacred among all the nations of the earth because of their peculiar sensitiveness to the astral fire, a mysterious agency in nature which the scientific world has contacted through its manifestations as electricity and magnetism. Lodestone and radium in the mineral world and various parasitic growths in the plant kingdom are strangely susceptible to this cosmic electric fire or universal life force. The magicians of the Middle Ages surrounded themselves with such creatures as bats, spiders, cats, snakes, and monkeys because they were able to appropriate the life forces of these species and use them to the attainment of their own ends. Some ancient schools of wisdom taught that all poisonous insects and reptiles are germinated out of the evil nature of man, and that when intelligent human beings no longer breed hate in their own souls, there will be no more ferocious animals, loathsome diseases, or poisonous plants and insects. Among the American Indians is the legend of a Spider-Man, whose web connected the heaven worlds with the earth. The secret schools of India symbolize certain of the gods who labored with the universe during its making, as connecting the realms of light with those of darkness by means of webs. Therefore, the builders of the cosmic system, who held the embryonic universe together with threads of invisible force, were sometimes referred to as the spider gods, and their ruler was designated the Great Spider. The beehive is found in masonry as a reminder that in diligence and labor for a common good, true happiness and prosperity are found. The bee is a symbol of wisdom, for as this tiny insect collects pollen from the flowers, so men may extract wisdom from the experiences of daily life. The bee is sacred to the goddess Venus, and according to mystics, it is one of several forms of life which came to the earth from the planet Venus millions of years ago. Wheat and bananas are said to be of similar origin. This is the reason why the origin of these 3 forms of life cannot be traced. The fact that bees are ruled by queens is one reason why this insect is considered a sacred feminine symbol. In India, the god Prana, the personification of the universal life force, is sometimes shown surrounded by a circle of bees. Because of its importance in pollinizing flowers, the bee is the accepted symbol of the generative power. At one time, the bee was the emblem of the French kings. The rulers of France wore robes embroidered with bees, and the canopies of their thrones were decorated with gigantic figures of these insects. The fly symbolizes the tormentor, because of the annoyance it causes to animals. The Chaldean god Baal was often called Baal-zebul, or the god of the dwelling place. The word zebub or zabab means a fly, and Baal-zebul became Baal-zebub or Beelzebub, a word which was loosely translated to mean Jupiter's fly. The fly was looked upon as a form of the divine power because of its ability to destroy decaying substances and thus promote health. The fly may have obtained its name Zebub from its peculiar buzzing or humming. Inman believes that Baalzebub, which the Jews ridiculed as my lord of flies, really means my lord who hums or murmurs.